Well, hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Randy Silva, and it is time to do another series in the series that I've been doing called The Church. This is my third series that I've done on my channel. They've all been about various Christian topics, and if you're watching this, I'm glad that you are. I hope you enjoy it, and please remember to like and subscribe. So let's go ahead and get started. This is the sixth part of a 8-part series called The Church. And this one is called To Divide or Not to Divide, from the Shakespearean To Be or Not to Be. But let's do a review from last week. So we talked about the major theological, political, socioeconomic, and intellectual reasons behind the Protestant Reformation of the early 16th century and the Restoration movement of the early 19th century. We looked at the key figures from the two movements from the Reformation period. It was Martin Luther, John Calvin, and Huldrych Zwingli. For the Restoration movement, it was Alexander Campbell and his father Thomas, Barton Stone, and a guy named Walter Scott, who was an evangelist. And we analyzed the explosive growth in the number of different churches and denominations. So growth in the church in terms of the number of members is a good thing, but growth in the number of divisions and number of denominations in the church is something else, which is usually not viewed as a positive thing. So it went from just around 100 denominations in the early 1800s to 45,000 now worldwide. The Restoration movement was important, which is why I talked about it, but it's responsible for a relatively small number of those different church divisions in the 200 years that have followed it. So most of those divisions come from the Protestant Reformation movement. So I wanted to start talking a little bit about why there are so many denominations. The Bible is clear that we are to avoid all other gospels. Let's look at Galatians 1:6-9. I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you to live in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel, which is really no gospel at all. Evidently, some people are throwing you into confusion and are trying to pervert the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach a gospel other than the one we preach to you, let them be under God's curse. As we have already said, now I say it again. If anybody is preaching to you a gospel other than the one you accepted, let them be under God's curse. So that's a big thing. You don't want to be under God's curse, right? So even here, very early in the church, this is probably around 50 AD or so, we see that there was some other form of Christianity that people were bringing into the Galatian churches. And Paul is disappointed in the Galatians as to how they handled it. He would have expected them to have recognized it as not a real gospel and to kick them out, not listen to them at all. Of course, he didn't like the fact that Judaizers were coming from Jerusalem and doing this in the first place. But here you can see that he was disappointed mostly with how the Galatians even gave them an ear and let their theology into their church. So at this early stage, what you see is this other gospel trying to make its way into the Gentile churches. It's important to see that the Gentile churches were viewed by the Judean churches as unorthodox, which means to be outside of the accepted teaching. So here we can see that if you are in a church, if we want to propagate this and move it forward, if you're in a church and somebody comes from maybe another part of the church or another family church from a different state or whatever, and starts preaching something which is outside of the Bible or outside of the gospel, then you are meant to not listen to them. But what we're talking about, you can see how this could be the start of divisions, especially if the Galatians were to have listened to them and not have been rebuked and listened to Paul. We're talking, though, about divisions. Why are there so many denominations? And divisions primarily come from within a church or denomination. When we were looking at the Reformation movement, all of those key figures started in churches, Presbyterian and Baptist churches. And nevertheless, it's pretty, I guess I would say, pretty rare when a new movement starts and some people get together and start thinking about a lot of different changes that have sort of accumulated over the past few centuries, and thinking about being radical, that is, going back to the root, starting something new which is closer to what they were supposed to be doing in the first place. Most of the time, though, divisions happen within a church, within a movement. Usually someone gets convicted about something in the theology or the liturgy or the culture within the church to a high enough degree that they begin being vocal over it. And if others concur with their thoughts, or if they strike a chord of a real problem, of a real issue that others see as important, that can form what's called a faction. And very rarely does the church leadership that's outside of this faction see eye to eye with them and agree to change the church. I'm not sure exactly why that would be. It seems to dwell with human nature, pride. Maybe more often than not that these factions are wrong in the first place. But even in the case where you might think this faction has a point, the church should probably change such and such, the church leadership is more often not willing to change that. And so then the church divides. And this faction typically is smaller than the full, it's not like a church split that's half-half. That can happen. That does happen. But a lot of times it's a splinter, meaning that this small movement starts outside the church. But that splinter tends to have a lot of moxie to it and a lot of conviction with it. And so it's possible then for that splinter to start growing faster than the church from which they split, and sometimes even sort of replace that church in the long run. Now in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, let's go ahead and look there. This is another scripture passage about church division. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 10 through 13, Paul says, I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you agree with one another in what you say, and that there may be no divisions among you, but that you may be perfectly united in mind and thought. My brothers and sisters, some from Chloe's household, have informed me that there are quarrels among you. What I mean is this: one of you says, I follow Paul, another, I follow Apollos, another, I follow Cephas, and still another, I follow Christ. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Were you baptized in the name of Paul? So these are all rhetorical questions. The answer to them all is an emphatic no. Christ is not divided. Paul was not crucified. It was Jesus who was crucified. And none of them were baptized in the name of Paul. They were baptized in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. So what Paul is starting to talk about here is the start or the precursor to factions is when people in a church start to put their allegiance in one of the church leaders. And here you can see some of the leaders that are mentioned are Paul himself, Apollos, Cephas, that's Peter, and another one is just sort of saying, I don't follow people, I follow Christ, which they're probably they're the most right of those. And so Paul says, is Christ divided? No, Christ is not divided. And so Paul, you can say, is nipping this in the bud. He does go on in subsequent chapters to talk about serious issues, cultural issues, things that the Corinthian church needed to change. And if they hadn't changed those things, then you could imagine that those things could cause splits. But what you can see here, at least, is that a precursor to divisions can be people following and listening and putting their heart behind a person instead of putting it behind God or the Word. Now, one of the statements that Paul makes here in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 10, says that there may be no divisions among you, but that you be perfectly united in mind and thought. So is Paul saying that we should have unity over the gospel, over doctrine, over the true gospel? Now, when he was saying this, as I was mentioning, the church needed to change a lot of different things about how they operated, about how they viewed sin, about how they treated each other, how their services went. But the gospel that Paul had taught them had not been, they hadn't diverged from it. So they were still, theologically speaking, following the same gospel. So when Paul calls them to say that you must be united in mind and thought and that there shouldn't be any divisions, he's talking to a church that is following the true gospel. So the problem occurs when someone thinks that the church is not following the true gospel. Then they would say, they might at the beginning say that, well, I'm going to be unified. I don't want to start a new church. I don't want to be a splinter or a division, or I know Christ is supposed to be one. And so initially try to make changes, initially try to get their church to change. But when it doesn't, then the true gospel overrules unity. We see that happening time and time again over history. You can see in the first 1,000 years of the church, up into the Great Schism, that a strong leadership kept a tight ship, and and there were no division. Well, there were a few divisions, but just a few. And then, as the Reformation period started, there started to be an acceleration in splits. So you end up with around 100 divisions by the 1800s, and then just explodes from then. 1,000 in 1900, 30,000 by the 1950s, or some number like that, ultimately reaching 45,000 now. I don't even know how there are 45,000 plus denominations. I mean, I have no idea. When I heard this number, I thought, how could that even be? How can there be that many differences in the gospel? Are there even that many, dimensions of the gospel with so many different types that, you can make a bunch of permutations to reach that number? I don't know. It was news to me. I was talking last week that a lot of them are in Southeast Asia and Africa. So there's definitely something going on there, but there's still a lot of denominations in the United States, the North America, South America, and Europe. I don't even know if these denominations know about each other. It's likely that these denominations have, you might have one denomination on one side of Africa that has the exact same worship style and beliefs as one on the other side of Africa, but they don't know about each other, and so they continue to be two different denominations. That's a possibility. One thing to talk about is this idea of differences in worship or church polity. Remember, that's how a church is governed. Like whether you have one main leader or you have a council of leaders or you have elders. So those types of differences versus differences in salvation. So there's a term that's called the essentials of the Christian faith. It describes the idea that there are various essential core tenets of the true gospel that can be defined and distinguished from secondary non-essential beliefs. And I was able to trace this idea back to the 17th century. I was thinking it was probably in the early 20th century. But in the 17th century, there was a Lutheran theologian named Rupertus Melodenius, and he created the maxim, in essentials, unity; in non-essentials, liberty; and in all things, charity. So you can see already at that early stage in the Reformation period, people were already starting to think, wow, we've got a lot of divisions. How do we keep this from exploding? And here they're saying that you could have different denominations that differ on non-essential beliefs, but are unified in essential beliefs. Insofar as salvation is concerned, as long as these denominations stick to certain core beliefs about God and Jesus, it's okay for them to differ in other non-salvation related things. But the problem comes when who decides what is essential and what is not? Do all the denominations actually come together and have this big meeting and decide this? Probably not. I mean, maybe there have been some conferences like that, but over the centuries. But likely it was more that someone identified certain key doctrines and found that a majority of churches and denominations followed them. So basically they looked at it like in a post-analysis and say, hey, you know what? These churches all are different, but they all believe that Jesus is the Son of God, for instance, and that he came down as a human on earth. Something we talked about 2 episodes ago, about how the nature of Christ, the understanding of the nature of Christ, was responsible for the first 2 splits of the church in the 5th century. One thing I will say is that the more dogmas a church have, remember, a dogma or someone who's dogmatic is someone who's very strict about a particular belief, that they believe that this is essential and you have to have it, and anybody who doesn't have it is outside of orthodoxy, what they consider orthodoxy. The more dogmas a church has, the more exclusive it is, but the more division proof it is. In other words, the more essential characteristics are defined as essential by denomination, the more other churches will fail to meet those essentials and be considered unorthodox. And the more, I would say, that those who are within the church are able to sort of claim their dogmas and kind of stand on that hill in an unmovable stance and point the finger at other people. Another thing I wanted to talk about is, why would God allow all these splits? Knowing that it's impossible to know the mind of God as a human, and that we only see a tiny fraction of reality. We're missing 99%, really 99.99%, of all the information. We have access to very small amount of the information that God has access to all of it. If we look in Romans chapter 8, verse 28, it says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that they might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. So, God works for the good of those who love him. And we can assume that God would do things differently if it would produce more of this goodness. That when one way of looking at it from metaphorically is that God is really good at making lemonade from lemons. So humans are very good at disrupting things, making errors, making mistakes, dividing things. But God is able to take our mistakes and make good of them. And he does that especially for those who love him and have been called according to his purpose. We must think that God knows what is going to happen in the future. He knows all the past, he knows the present, he knows the future. You can see that in this verse 29. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. So God knows everything. And so he has to be maximizing some sort of attribute. I like to think of it as maybe the total number of people saved, or maybe the total number of people who have a chance to be saved. But that he somehow can look down the line, look down in the future, and see if a certain change is made right now, that will cause things to go one direction instead of going straight. And if that change results in more of X, where X is people who are saved, or some sort of characteristic like that, then God would make such a decision. We see this pattern in the Bible that typically, the Bible is sort of, you can kind of consider it the highlights or the lowlights of humankind, of human nature, but it's actually relatively short as far as a history book is concerned. It covers 4,000 years. Well, the Bible covers 2,000 years, and then there's been 2,000 years since then. So we don't see, for instance, something like the flood happening very often. It happened once. We don't see a nation like Israel being delivered from Egyptians happening every day. It seems like it only happened once, where God went in and extracted a group of people for his purposes and split a sea in order to accomplish that. So it seems like God allows things to develop kind of organically, normally, like a large percentage of the time. But then only on very rare occasions he works directly with an individual and does something like conspicuously supernatural, like for everybody to see. Everybody can see this flood, or see this splitting of the Red Sea, or even Jesus himself performing all these miracles. That a group can see all those things. Those tend to be more on the rare time. So if God works for the good of all the people who love him, and he knows all things, and he knows the future, then you could think that he would then be able to change certain events if he doesn't like what the future is. He would know what to change. Like even if I make a prediction about my life, like with my job, I might think, I don't like the way things are going with my job. I'm going to find a new job. I have to go out and first of all, I have to make that guess that things aren't actually going well in my job, and it's to the point where I should get another job. And then I have to go out and get that other job, and who knows what that other job's going to be like. It could end up being worse than my current situation. So, but someone like God, who's not limited by the dimensions that we live in, he would know exactly, whether or not something does need to change, and if something does need to change, how does it need to change in order to produce a certain outcome. An example I thought of that was not just with my life, but like in the Marvel series, Doctor Strange, he has to use this time stone thing. It's all fiction, of course. Um, he goes out and tries 1 million different possibilities, and he comes back and he found one out of 1 million that worked. And who knows how long it took for him to experience doing 1 million different things in order for one of them to work out. And so he must have been doing this for several, like 1 million years. But God wouldn't have to do it that way. God would be able to know precisely what to do in order to make a certain change. Now, if you think about one of these big crossroads, one of these big events, I immediately think about Constantine and Theodosius, who we talked about a few episodes ago. Constantine, in the Edict of Milan, I believe it was 313 AD, made Christianity legal. Before that, it was illegal. And then Theodosius, in 380 AD, made Christianity the state religion, or the only legal religion. And that had huge implications. I mean, the good thing would be that these Christians wouldn't have to fear for their lives anymore when they're worshiping. So that's a good thing. But it also produced a massive influx of pagan Romans that overwhelmed the church. Constantine himself claimed to have seen something supernatural in the sky, and that it led to a supernatural victory. Who knows? But nevertheless, we see the big decision that he made Christianity the state religion, ultimately. And then as soon as that happened, in 380 AD with Theodosius, then the church came into all kinds of wealth and power saturated the church that it had never had. It had always been on the fringe. It had always been kind of running for its life, hiding in corners, and so forth. And then all of a sudden you see things like fancy buildings and not temples, they didn't call them temples, but churches, and fancy priestly clothing immediately emerged. And you see this very large split occur very quickly between what's called the clergy and the laity, the leadership of the church and just your average members. You could point the finger at Satan and say, well, Satan had to have done this. Satan had to have been the one who gave Constantine that sign, and he also had to have been the one who manipulated Theodosius to make it the only legal religion. Satan had to have been behind that. But you also have to consider that with God's omniscience, that he was maximizing something like the number of people saved, and that things wouldn't happen by an accident or without his prior knowledge or without his planning. If you think about Isaiah 46, 9 through 10. Remember the former things, those of long ago. I am God, there is no other. I am God, there is none like me. I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times what is to come. I say, my purpose will stand, and I will do all that I please. So God definitely says that is his character, that is his being, as being the only true God, that he has knowledge for these things. So I think you have to be skeptical of anyone who says, Satan is behind some important pivotal event in history and that it was all bad. You'd have to say that whatever happened with Constantine and Theodosius and other types of large events, that God somehow was using those things to maximize some good of God. What I was going to do is talk about how one even starts to make the decision of choosing a church. And I also wanted to talk about my own history with churches, as well as how I got to even doing this series in the first place. So I'm going to do that next time. For part 7, we'll talk about my reason for doing this series, not just this series, but the previous two and future series in in the future as well. And also try to come up with something for, I don't know if we could call it rule of thumb or what have you. But what are the preconditions for choosing a church when there are so many different churches that are out there? And what does a typical person have to do, especially when they're initially seeking God for the first time? What kind of advice would I give to someone who is new to Christianity and looking for a church? So thanks again for joining me. Appreciate everyone who can watch this and learn from it. And again, remember to like and subscribe, and we will see you next Sunday at 5 o'clock. Thanks.